Hello everybody and welcome to the Winecast. This cast picks up where the last one on the Northern Rhône left off, and we're tackling the southern half of the Rhône Valley. As you can see from the subtitle of this cast, which is a bit tongue-in-cheek, the Southern Rhône is going to take a little more effort to unpack than the northern half. But don't worry, once you get the logic that the area is organized by, everything comes together pretty quickly, and it's really worth the effort you'll invest to get to know the region, since this is, to my mind anyway, one of the most interesting and sometimes underappreciated wine regions in France. So let's start with some contrasts. You can think of the Southern Rhône as being different from the Northern Rhône in three big ways. First, the two differ in terms of terroir. In the much smaller Northern Rhône, you'll find most of the vineyards on steep hillsides surrounding the Rhône River, often so steep that they need to be terraced to allow viticulture at all. But in the south, many vineyards are in relatively flat lowland areas that spread out from the river, with some appellations in the area at a pretty good distance from the water. And if you're ever fortunate enough to take a trip out that way, look around the vineyards in the north and east parts of CHATEAUNEUF-DU-PAPE, the region's most famous appellation, and you're likely to see one of the Southern Rhone's most distinctive terroir features, galettes. Smooth cobblestones and pebbles that litter the vineyard land and not only help with drainage for the vines, but also absorb heat during the day and then radiate it back to the vines at night, giving them a boost with ripening. There's also a difference between the two regions when it comes to the grapes grown in each one, with 4 grapes, Syrah, Viognier, Marsanne, and Roussanne, doing all the work in the north. But the south gets the job done with around 24 grape varieties, the most important of which would be Grenache, getting some help from Syrah and Mourvedre, but they're supported by a large cast of players, many of which are native to the region and that you won't see in too many other wines. The sheer number of varietals in the south leads to the last big difference between the two, wine styles. While both regions make reds and whites, in the north the emphasis is on single varietals, with maybe a little blending to round out the wine. But in the south, blends rule the roost, and while there tends to be a dominant grape in most of those blends, usually Grenache, that grape can and often will be partnered with at least a couple of others, and often quite a few more. Because of the emphasis on Syrah in the north, reds from that area tend to be big and tannic, and can usually stand to age for a while. But in the south, thanks to the starring role played by Grenache, the reds are lighter in color, body, and tannin, and usually pack a little more punch in the alcohol department. Finally, the south makes rosé, a style absent from the north, with several appellations in the area producing pinks, and one appellation, Tavel, making nothing but. Despite all of this diversity, though, let's be clear, the Southern Rhône is red country, with reds making up 85% of total production, followed by rosé at just under 10%, and with white rounding out the total and coming in at around 5% of production. Here's a map of the Southern Rhône and its appellations. The appellation we need to start with is the Côtes du Rhône and the Côtes du Rhône Village, which are both contained within the same geographic area represented here in beige. In addition to being the largest of the Southern Rhône appellations, it also contains all of the most important and best-known sub-appellations in the region. Yes, there are a number of appellations that abut or lie outside of the main Côtes du Rhône appellation, but despite being joined to the Rhône administratively, they have much stronger affinities with the neighboring wine region of Provence. So for our purposes, we can consider these appellations in another cast, and focus for the time being on the Côtes du Rhône AOC and the various appellations that it contains. Now there is one appellation, CLAIRETTE, that also lies outside the main Rhône appellation, but we'll consider it here because it produces a unique sparkling wine with an unusual method, and otherwise marches to the beat of its own drum. So let's begin by going back to the Côtes du Rhône. AOC Côtes du Rhône is the most basic appellation that covers the Southern Rhône, much the same way that AOC Bourgogne and AOC Bordeaux cover their respective regions. AOC Côtes du Rhône also covers the Northern Rhône, but very little wine is produced under it in the north, with most winemakers preferring to make the extra effort to qualify for one of the 8 smaller appellations that we looked at in the Northern Rhône cast. This appellation is a much bigger deal in the south, with quite a bit of the region's wine, red, rosé, and white, produced under it. A step up in terms of quality from the general appellation is AOC Côtes du Rhône Village. This sub-appellation recognizes about 90 villages within the Côtes du Rhône appellation that tend to produce wine at a higher level of quality than other areas with the general appellation. Of these 90 villages, 18 of them have distinguished themselves to the point that they've won the right to place their village name on the label, and while wines from the general Côtes du Rhône app and just the generic Côtes du Rhône village can be hit or miss, you're on much more consistent ground in terms of quality when you buy wines from named Côtes du Rhône villages. In February 2016, one of these 18 villages, perhaps the most famous one, Cairan, was elevated to AOC status. Though at the time of this cast, the official decree of this new status is still pending. But barring accidents, look for wines from AOC Cairan and not Côtes du Rhône Cairan to show up on wine store shelves in the near future. The best-known sub-appellation of the Côtes du Rhône might just be CHATEAUNEUF-DU-PAPE. The name means something like the Pope's new castle and refers to a papal residence built by Pope John XXII after his predecessor Clement V moved the papacy to the nearby city of Avignon in the early 1300s. In addition to its history with the heads of the Catholic Church, this is a very important and famous area in the history of French wine, and was actually the first area to receive the AOC status in France. But for more information on that, check out the cast on French wine quality designations. Châteauneuf produces both red and white wines with, depending on how you count, 13 or 18 varietals to choose from when making these wines. The varietals available include red grapes, white grapes, and gray grapes, and they add up to either 13 or 18 depending on whether or not you count the different colored versions of Grenache, Picpoul, and Clairette as one grape or multiple grapes. White varietals can be added to red wines, and Châteauneuf has an unusual set of regulations that gives all 13 varietals the status of a main grape in the blend, so it's theoretically possible to make a Châteauneuf out of any one of the 13 varietals or any combination of them. In practice, though, despite the possibilities for blending, most Châteauneufs are driven by Grenache, supported by a handful of other varietals. Instead of Grenache, some Châteauneufs have Mourvèdre as the major player, and the tannic nature of this grape can help to give Châteauneufs driven by it greater age-worthiness. Finally, Châteauneufs are a great way to get to know a famous aroma found in Southern Rhône wines. Known as garrigue, it's an aroma of dried herbs like marjoram, oregano, savory, thyme, and rosemary that are common in herb blends from Provence, and this aroma is part of the general savoriness and earthiness that characterizes red Châteauneufs, as well as other Southern Rhône reds. 5 appellations in the area, LIRAC, VACQUEYRAS, GIGONDAS, RASTEAU, and VINSOBRES, all produce red wines that overlap in style, and some also produce whites and rosés, and, in the case of Rasteau, a fortified dessert wine called a vin doux naturel based on Grenache. The varietals used by these appellations cover the Rhône spectrum, though Grenache is the only main variety in most of these appellations and can make up to 75 to 85% or more of the blend. LIRAC is a bit more flexible and recognizes Syrah, Mourvèdre, and Cinsault as main varietals alongside Grenache. These wines aren't as famous as their cousin Châteauneuf closer to the river, but that relative obscurity can make these wines great bargains, as the consensus is that the best of these can deliver the same quality as the best Châteauneufs, especially when you're looking for wines from Gigondas, VACQUEYRAS, and LIRAC. This chart will give you a sense of the styles that you can expect from each of these appellations, and as you can see, here as almost everywhere else, red is king. But there are always exceptions, and Tavel, across the Rhône from Châteauneuf and just south of LIRAC, is unique among French appellations for being the only one in France to be regulated solely for the production of rosé. The main varietals are the usual Rhône suspects, Grenache, Mourvèdre, Syrah, and Counoise, along with a suite of others including some white grapes. If they are used, the whites will be crushed and fermented together with the red grapes. Also unique among appellations in France, or anywhere else for that matter, Tavel's rosés can be age-worthy, not just surviving for a few years in the bottle, but actually benefiting from that time, unlike other rosés that tend to lose their spark after more than a year in the bottle. There are 2 appellations in Baume de Venise, a standard AOC that produces red wines based on Grenache and not dissimilar to the reds produced by its neighbors, and an appellation, Muscat de Baume de Venise, that exclusively produces vin doux naturel from, you guessed it, Muscat. Lastly, a little north and east of the main Côtes du Rhône appellation sits CLAIRETTE, an AOC that produces sparkling wines made from a majority of Muscat, as well as possibly some Clairette. This wine is especially interesting because it's made in the ancestral method, A very old way, and probably the original way of producing sparklers, in which the wine is bottled before being completely fermented and finishes its fermentation in the bottle, making bubbles. Clairette have very floral aromas and are usually at least a little sweet. But there are also AOCs in the same area that produce dry traditional method sparklers, as well as still wines. So you're new to this region or just want to get to know it a little better. What should you try first? Well, you can start at the basic AOC, but both here and at the generic Côtes-du-Rhône village level, quality tends to be a mixed bag. There are some good deals here, but finding them will take some research on your part, and if you just pull a basic Côtes-du-Rhône or a Côtes-du-Rhône village off the rack at the store, you could end up with something thin and not very exciting. You're on much safer footing, though, if you move one tier up the quality scale and invest in a Côtes-du-Rhône from a named village. There are currently 18 villages, which will go down to 17 once Chiron is officially recognized as an AOC, that can add their name to the label. I won't list the villages here, but they're easy to spot. Just look for a place name above the Côtes-du-Rhône village AOC on the label. And if you're in doubt about a particular bottle, a quick online search or question to a store employee should give you all the information that you need. The real reputation for quality is at the AOC level, and here Châteauneuf gets all the attention. But if you want to save some shekels without sacrificing quality, try wines from GIGONDAS, VACQUEYRAS, and LIRAC, appellations that make their wines in a comparable style to Châteauneuf. And don't forget that these appellations also make either a white or a rosé or both, so check those out too. But if you're really hankering to drink a pink, definitely try a bottle of Tavel. Rosés here are dry and have lots of body and flavor. They can age for a few years too, but it's no sin at all to drink them when they've just been released. For dessert, check out RASTEAU's Vin du Naturel, made in both a red style called a Thuillier, that makes for a great pairing with chocolate, and a white style called an Ambré. Muscat de Baume de Venise is fantastic with desserts that have baked fruit and caramel components, but also works well with lighter sweets. And if you want to celebrate while having dessert, pop the cork on a bottle of Clairette that will be delicately flavored with notes of peach and honey and lightly fizzy and easy on the alcohol. Thanks again for joining me for another Winecast. I hope this cast gave you a clearer sense of what the Southern Rhône is all about and what's out there to be tasted. If it did, please like this cast and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. I'd love to hear suggestions for future casts or just any old thought you'd like to post in the comments. I'm your host, the Unknown Winecaster, and I'm out. Enjoy the grape, but always enjoy it responsibly.